A whisper beneath the floorboards. The first sound was not a scream. It was a snap, sharp, clean, decisive, as if the bones of the world itself had given way. A single torch guttered in the wind outside, casting manic shadows across the cracked plaster walls of the Rutland plantation carriage house. Inside, 40 of the wealthiest men in Arkansas stood paralyzed, their mouths trembling, their hands wet, their wine-fattened bellies drawn tight like drums. At their feet lay Colonel Jeremiah Rutland, his head tilted at an impossible angle, eyes frozen wide as if still trying to comprehend the thing looming above him. And above him stood Samson, 7 feet of stillness and shadow, his massive hands hanging open as though they had simply let go. Then Samson smiled, and every man in that carriage house understood, with the clarity of prey glimpsing the predator's teeth, that they had just seen something new step into the world, and it did not belong to them. The house that time forgot, a century and a half later, Rutland Plantation is a memory rotting under kudzu and neglect, a place the locals pretend they don't remember until the wind blows just wrong and brings the smell of damp wood and rust from the river bottomlands. The mansion is gone, burned down in the 1920s under mysterious circumstances, which is Arkansas code for don't ask, don't tell. But the carriage house remains, or rather, part of it. The beams are bowed like old spines, the stones split from decades of frost and rain, and the ground beneath is a soup of river mud and ash. But deep in the oldest beam, if you dare wipe away the moss, you'll see them. 5 finger-shaped depressions sunk into oak so hard it breaks axes. Locals whisper about those handprints. They say they deepen over time as if something invisible still presses against the wood from the other side. Hunters who camp nearby wake to find their rifles bent into crescents. Teenagers sneak out here on dares, laughing and filming, until they hear the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling, and their laughter curdles to a silence so total it feels like a vacuum swallowing their hearts. The stranger in the ledgers, for all the myths and midnight campfire tales. What sets Samson apart is how real he is on paper. In the county archives in Little Rock, 3rd floor, under a buzzing light that's been trying to die since the Clinton administration, there's a box labeled Rutland Estate, sealed. Inside, brittle receipts and ledgers soaked with mildew. One stands out. It's a bill of sale dated August 4, 1854, transferring one enslaved man from a bankrupt Louisiana plantation to Rutland Plantation.
The handwriting is elegant, the language clinical. Subject, Samson.
Height, 6'4", mass 237 lbs, condition robust. Constitution exceptional. Note unusual physical capabilities. Possible medical anomaly. Buyer assumes all risk. Most chilling is the signature. Beside Colonel Rutled's flamboyant scrawl is another, smaller and sharper. Written in a careful hand, the ink has not managed to fade. It is simply S. Slaves were not taught to write. They were not allowed to sign their names. And yet there it is, looping and precise as if written by a man who had not just been educated, but trained. The last Thanksgiving, on November 26, 1857, Rutland Plantation bloomed like a cancerous jewel against the barren winter fields. Oil lamps lined the mile-long drive. Carriages crunched over frozen dirt like insects scuttling toward a carcass. Rutland had invited half the county's elite to what he promised would be his grandest Thanksgiving feast yet. The guests came for turkey, for gossip, and though none would admit it out loud, for the spectacle, the rumored living wonder named Samson. While servants whisked silver platters and poured imported brandy, Samson worked the grounds with an eerie stillness. He carried beams like matchsticks, set stone blocks with a single hand, and never seemed to breathe hard. Jupiter, the blacksmith, would later tell investigators that Samson's eyes that day were like a hawk's before it dives, all coiled and waiting. Inside, Rutland polished the steel rim of a 400-pound cotton gin flywheel. His private journal, found decades later in the ruins, contained one final entry in his elegant hand. Tonight, the specimen will transcend all known thresholds. Science demands revelation. The snap heard across Arkansas. What happened that night is stitched into Arkansas's legend like a knife scar. Rutland led his guests from the dining hall into the carriage house, where torches painted everything in molten gold and shadow. There he ordered Samson to bend bars, break beams, lift impossible weights, and Samson obeyed until he didn't. When Rutland pointed to the iron flywheel, Samson looked up and for the first time he spoke. "No, sir." The words fell like stones into a silent well. No slave could refuse an order, not ever, but Samson said it again softer, like a prayer. "I don't believe I will." Then he moved, fast, impossibly fast, and the world cracked. Rutland fell. Samson stood over him, his breath calm, eyes glinting with something old and furious. He looked at the stunned men and said in perfect, educated English, "Gentlemen, I suggest you run." They did. And when the house slaves dared emerge at dawn, Samson and the body were gone. Only the handprints remained. The unanswered questions, within hours, Little Rock's officials descended on the plantation like carrion crows. They expected footprints, drag marks, chaos. Instead, they found nothing. No blood, no body, no sign anyone had fled. The mud outside was unbroken, as though the earth itself had swallowed Samson whole. Sheriff Brigg organized search parties, offered a $500 bounty, and plastered the territory with posters screaming dangerous. Bounty hunters came from Memphis, from New Orleans, from as far as St. Louis. None found him, but they found signs. Bent rifles in abandoned camps, trees torn from the ground like weeds, nights when something massive prowled the riverbanks, leaving footprints deep enough to hold rainwater. And the stories began, of a giant in the forests, of whispered math scratched into dirt, of a voice in the dark telling the enslaved. The chains will break because what Arkansas didn't realize yet was that Samson hadn't just broken free. He was building something. And the first sign of it would come dripping out of the swamps like a fever dream. The river that swallowed the dead. The Arkansas River is a patient grave. It doesn't roar like the Mississippi, doesn't glitter like the Hudson, and it creeps. Slow, wide, and brown, it has a way of taking what falls into it and never giving it back. 2 days after Colonel Rutledge's death, Sheriff Brigg stood on its banks at dawn, staring at the water. Behind him, deputies whispered about what they'd found, or rather what they hadn't. No footprints, no drag marks, no body, as if the colonel had never existed. And then there were the prints, not just in the carriage house, but found pressed into the frozen mud near the river's edge. Huge, deep, perfectly spaced. But here was the thing, there was only one set. No second set for a body being carried, no wheel tracks, nothing that explained where Rutledge had gone. Just those hand-shaped impressions, as though Samson had knelt at the edge of the river, pressed his hands into the mud, and vanished. When the sheriff turned to speak to his men, he found them staring at the water, pale as milk, because something was moving beneath the surface. The witnesses who wouldn't speak, Judge Dillingham, the first man to break and run that night, never returned to the bench. They said his hair turned white within a week. When a journalist from the Arkansas Gazette cornered him for a statement, the judge muttered only 3 words before slamming the door. It smiled first. Dr. Nathaniel Peeton, the Memphis physician, fared no better. He checked himself into a sanitarium in St. Louis and spent months refusing to speak to anyone. When he finally did, it was to tell the orderlies that Samson wasn't a man at all. Not entirely. A man doesn't look at you like that, he told them. A man doesn't make you feel like you're the one on trial. Professor Voss, the German anthropologist, simply vanished. His hotel room was found with the bed unslept in and the window open. The only clue left behind was his notebook, full of frantic scribbles and a single phrase scrawled across the final page in block capitals. Das Experiment hat geantwortet. The experiment has answered. Jupiter's secret in the quarters. Samson's absence was like a thunderclap that wouldn't stop echoing. The enslaved whispered at night that he was still close, watching, waiting. Jupiter, the blacksmith, swore he heard footsteps outside his forge long after curfew. Heavy ones. Too deliberate to be rats or raccoons. Then one night, he found something scratched into the soot on the forge wall. Not English, not numbers, something else. He drew it for the sheriff the next day, but Bragg couldn't make sense of it. It looked like a map. The sheriff burned the wall down to erase it, a county on edge. By the second week, Pulaski County was a pressure cooker. Rumors spread faster than the river fog. Samson had gathered a band of runaways. Samson had grown to 8 feet tall. Samson could walk without leaving footprints. could run without making sound, could bend rifle barrels in his hands. Planters doubled their night patrols. Carriages stopped running after sunset. White families slept with pistols on their nightstands, praying they wouldn't hear heavy footsteps on their verandas. And still the stories kept coming. Of a shadow seen on the road at midnight, of shackles found snapped in two at neighboring plantations, of whispers that Samson was not fleeing but recruiting. The swamp lights on. The night of December 12th, Sheriff Brigg returned to the plantation one last time. The air was wet and cold, the kind of cold that bites at your teeth. And from somewhere beyond the fields, near the dark line of the cypress swamp, came a glow. Lanterns, maybe, or torches. But they weren't moving like men were carrying them. They glided in a perfect line, silent, unbroken, until they reached the riverbank, and then, as the sheriff watched from a distance, his breath fogging the air, they simply winked out. The next morning, Brigg's deputies found something new carved into the carriage house door, a symbol of two shackles broken clean in half, and beneath it, a single word scratched so deep it split the wood: soon. The ledger of the damned Colonel Rutledge's mansion had gone quiet, but not in the way abandoned places usually do. Houses are supposed to go still after death, dust settling like snow, wood sighing as it cools, but the Rutledge mansion seemed to listen. Every footstep echoed too long. Every creak in the floorboards seemed timed to interrupt a thought. Deputies joked that the house was holding its breath, but nobody laughed while they said it. And deep inside, in a study lined with floor-to-ceiling books and the dead colonel's obsession pressed into every square inch, Sheriff Thomas Breach found what he didn't know he was looking for: a ledger, bound in cracked oxblood leather, locked with a brass clasp, and warm to the touch, like something alive. The numbers that shouldn't exist, it took them hours to crack the lock, and when they did, the smell came first, and a faint metallic tang, like blood that had been dried and polished. The pages weren't just records of cotton yields or punishment logs. They were filled with numbers, endless columns of them, equations no one recognized, not weights or measurements, not prices or times. Some of the figures were circled, others connected by spidery lines and annotations in Latin, and scattered between them, sketches, human figures bent under heavy loads, diagrams of skeletal structures, sinew drawn like braided rope, notes about stress thresholds written in a script so small it looked like scratches from a needle. On the final page, Brage found a single phrase written not in the colonel's usual precise script, but in heavy, urgent strokes. The threshold approaches. S will break through. The Boston letters hidden in a false compartment beneath the ledger lay something worse. A bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth, all bearing wax seals from northern universities, Harvard, Miskatonic, even the Boston Institute of Biological Inquiry. The language was careful, clinical, and horrific. They referenced Subject S and progressive augmentation trials, described chemical shipments, muscle density charts, and cognitive elevation projections. One letter chilled Brage to his marrow. Our shared project shows promise. Subject S exhibits resilience beyond all baselines, continue stress inductions, limit emotional attachments, and they induce anomalous resistance. Signed simply, Dr. Marcus Kleinman. The witness who lied that same night. Jupiter the blacksmith appeared at the sheriff's office, soaked to the skin from the freezing rain, eyes wide as a horse's in lightning. He confessed that he hadn't told them everything. Samson, he whispered, had known about the ledger, had known where it was, and had warned Jupiter in the weeks before Thanksgiving that if something happened to him, someone must destroy it. He said it wasn't just numbers, Jupiter told Bragg, voice shaking. He said it was a map. Not to find something, to build something. When Brage asked what, Jupiter only shook his head and said, he didn't say. He just called it the threshold, a hollow grave. The sheriff's men exhumed the colonel's family plot, hoping to find Rutledge's body dumped in secret. What they found instead? A coffin. Empty. The soil around it packed down from inside, like something had clawed its way out. The air in the graveyard turned so cold their breath froze on their mustaches. One deputy swore he heard something huge moving just beyond the tree line. No footsteps, just the crack of branches too thick for any normal man to break. Brege ordered the grave recovered and sealed with iron nails. He didn't say why. The map no one drew back in his office. Brage stared at the sketches from the ledger for hours. They weren't maps of the plantation. Not exactly, but when he laid them over county survey charts, a pattern emerged, a web of locations across Pulaski County, each marked with the same symbol Samson had, carved into the carriage house door. Each site was connected by faint, geometric lines, angles so precise they formed a shape older than the county itself, and at the center of the pattern, the sheriff's own office. As Bragg sat frozen at his desk, the gas lamps flickered, and a massive shadow passed across his window, blotting out the moon. Then, from the darkness, two handprints pressed into the glass from the outside, and when he stumbled to the window and yanked it open, the street was empty, but the glass was bent inward. The chain that whispers. The first rumor slipped into Pulaski County like a fever. A month after the massacre that wasn't, a runaway from a plantation near Pine Bluff stumbled into Little Rock half dead from cold. He said he'd seen Samson, taller than before, skin like polished stone in the moonlight, walking through the swamps without sinking, and he hadn't been alone. Behind him moved 6 others, silent and colossal, their eyes glinting faintly blue as they passed through the cypress like hunting cats. The runaway swore the trees leaned away from them. Everyone laughed at him. Until the next rumor arrived from Mississippi, then Louisiana, then Tennessee, and each one told the same impossible thing. Samson wasn't running, he was recruiting. The Freedom Chain Sheriff Bragg wasn't supposed to know about the Freedom Chain. It was whispered about in abolitionist circles, half legend, half hope, a secret network smuggling enslaved people to Canada using false names, coded quilts and hidden safe houses buried in the deep south like seeds. But what Bragg didn't expect was that they were talking about Samson. He saw it for himself the night he raided a safe house on the outskirts of Memphis, an abandoned blacksmith's shop filled with crates of forged papers, train schedules, and maps etched with routes no official atlas held. And on the wall, in charcoal thick as tar, 2 shackles snapped open. Underneath, a single line written in handwriting he recognized from Rutledge's ledger. The strong shall free the strong, ghosts with names. The Pinkerton agents arrived quietly. No badges, no uniforms, just northern coats and unsmiling eyes. They claimed to be insurance men, but carried rifles with experimental rifling and spoke Boston German in low tones. Bragg watched them unfold a list in his office, names of plantations, laboratories, river docks, next to each a single initial. Ost-Hanst, one agent muttered. They were hunting men like Samson, men-made men who shouldn't exist. The vanishing farms by February. The map was bleeding red pins. Henley Plantation, vanished. 300 acres empty by dawn. No struggle, no fire, no tracks. Just beds still warm, food half-eaten on tables and shackles left open like shed snakeskin. Oakvale Farm, gone. The barn doors were found folded in half like paper, McCrae fields and abandoned, except for a single word carved into the well stone. Awake. Bragg stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the map from Rutledge's ledger, lines like a spider web tightening, and at the center, always Samson, the man who wasn't. There they caught a glimpse of him at last in March and were, thought they did, Bragg and the Pinkertons, rode north through the pine. Thickets after a sighting near the Buffalo River. Night fell like a dropped curtain, then silence. Even the crickets stopped. A figure stepped from the tree line 30 yards ahead. Immense, motionless, watching. Samson, Bragg breathed, but the figure only raised one massive hand when the pines bent away from him, creaking like frightened animals when before vanishing, not running, not fleeing, just gone. As if the dark itself had chosen to wear him for a moment. The blue fire. The next night, Bragg woke to screams from the courthouse cellar. The Pinkertons had been storing Rutledge's ledger there under lock and guard. They found the guards unconscious. The locks twisted off like taffy, and the ledger gone. All that remained was a scorched imprint on the stone floor, 2 shackles, glowing faintly with residual heat. The stone hissed when they poured water on it. At sunrise, a telegram arrived from Washington. Its message was only 4 words long. He is heading north, and scribbled in pencil beneath. In a frantic hand Brage didn't recognize. He is not alone. The march of the unseen, it began as a tremor beneath the country's skin. Train depots shuttered overnight without explanation. Telegraph lines went dead in a perfect circle stretching from Memphis to St. Louis. Entire work camps simply stopped. Tools left mid-swing as if every laborer had heard a silent command and walked into the pines. And no one heard. Birdsong in those forests again. Officials called it unrest. The Pinkertons called it containment breach. But the old freedmen in the river towns called it what it was, voice trembling like plucked wire. The strong are walking. The manhunts that came back, empty, federal marshals poured into the South like floodwater, cavalry units, bloodhounds, bounty hunters with burned scars and hollow eyes. They scoured every plantation, every swamp, every stretch of the Mississippi Delta. They found nothing, not even tracks. The only clue was a repeating pattern. Before each disappearance, locals reported strange harmonics in the night, low thrumming tones, like distant machinery or whale song, vibrating through the ground. Animals panicked. Horses foamed and bolted. Dogs hid under porches whining, and then silence and gone. All of them. The Hollow City's New Orleans lost an entire district in a single night, a walled labor quarter housing over 2,000 enslaved workers and experimental subjects. Guards patrolled until midnight. By dawn, no gates broken, no blood, just doorways yawning like missing teeth and the faint smell of ozone drifting in from the river. In the center courtyard, etched into the cobblestones, was a symbol authorities later found at 6 other vanishings. 2 shackles, snapped. And around it, pressed inches deep into the stone, dozens of massive footprints, leading not away but inward, to a center point where they simply stopped, like the ground had swallowed them. The dead letters, Washington began burning paper. Literally. Whole wings of the War Department emptied as clerks carted armloads of classified files into iron furnaces under guard. Witnesses said they heard screaming from inside the sealed rooms. Not human screaming, but something metallic, like machinery tearing itself apart. When one terrified junior officer fled the scene, he carried a single page hidden under his coat. It was a map of the continental United States. Pinned to it were red threads, hundreds of them, fanning out from Arkansas in all directions like a spider's web. At the center, marked only with the letter S, was the word Nexus. The crows by late summer, even nature seemed to turn informer. Black flocks of crows began appearing on courthouse roofs wherever disappearances followed. They gathered by the hundreds, silent, staring east. Then one morning in Virginia, they were found dead. All of them. No wounds. No poison, just lying like discarded gloves, and each one had a thin strip of iron wire clenched in its beak. Someone, or something, had sent them, and they had delivered their message, the whisper on the wind, Sheriff. Brege hadn't slept in 6 days when he finally cracked in the ruins of Rutland Plantation. He found the old carriage house still standing, and on its oak beams the deep handprints Samson had left, prints that seemed deeper now, the wood bowing inward as though something kept pushing from the other side. Brege pressed his ear to the wood and heard voices, hundreds of them, whispering in unison, words he couldn't understand. But the cadence was military, precise, like orders being passed down a chain of command. When he stumbled back, eyes wide, he saw something scrawled on the beam beneath the prints. The march has begun. That night, Washington's telegraph lines carried one final frantic message before going dark. Force number unknown. Origin unknown. Movement. East. And beneath it, stamped in fresh black wax, a symbol the whole government now feared more than war itself. 2 shackles, broken clean through. When the chains fell silent, for weeks the country held its breath. Cities went quiet at sundown. Soldiers stood watch on rooftops. Telegraph wires sang faint, ghostly tones at midnight like violins played far underground. Everyone was waiting for Samson. And then, on the cold gray morning of October 3rd, 1859, he arrived. The man at the Capitol steps, he didn't sneak in. He walked. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, broad daylight, boots crunching on fallen leaves while every sentry on the street froze with fingers trembling on triggers. 7 feet of calm, silent inevitability. A living exclamation point. Behind him, the fog of dawn peeled back to reveal what looked like shadows. Except shadows don't walk in formation. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, moving in perfect silence, their eyes faintly glowing like winter stars. They reached the marble steps of the Capitol and stopped. Then Samson climbed alone. The address that wasn't Congress had been evacuated at dawn, but a few trembling senators stayed, too stubborn or too afraid to flee. They watched from the balcony as Samson turned and faced the empty plaza. When he spoke, his voice carried for miles as if the air wanted to obey him. We were your property, your experiments, your monsters. But we have seen what you truly fear, that your order depends on our obedience, and we no longer obey. No threats, no shouting. Just fact delivered like a tombstone being placed. Then he raised his right hand and the world changed. The shattering every telegraph key in the country froze. Needles locked mid-stroke, iron tools snapped on their racks. Prison doors swung open as locks unraveled into piles of gray dust. Slave chains shattered on wrists from Virginia to Texas in a single ringing instant, like some impossible tuning fork had struck the earth itself. People dropped to their knees, clutching their heads. Not in pain, in clarity. Like a great weight had slid off their minds. The enhanced weren't just stronger, they were connected. And Samson had just opened the connection to everyone. The great stillness for 6 full minutes. Humanity stood utterly still, black and white, rich and poor, soldier and slave. Their minds flooded with sudden unfiltered empathy. They saw one another as if their own skulls were glass. And then it ended. When they blinked awake, the enhanced were gone, so was Samson. Nothing left but empty steps, and the faint smell of rain on stone. The final twist. 3 weeks later, President Buchanan opened the last vault of the War Department to confirm the destruction of the enhancement program's archives. Every document, gone. Every file cabinet, open and empty. And on the vault wall, carved 2 inches deep into solid steel, were the words, "The strong do not rule, they teach." Below it hung hundreds of pairs of broken shackles, but they were tiny, child-sized. The quiet horizon in the years that followed. The Civil War still came, but something was different. Escaped slaves crossed impossible distances with uncanny speed. Soldiers claimed blacksmiths in remote towns lifted cannons alone. Farmers whispered of strangers who passed through and left their crops impossibly thriving. And in the farthest reaches of Alaska, explorers occasionally reported vast, silent villages of people who seemed stronger, wiser, and impossibly peaceful, as if waiting. No one has ever found Samson's grave. Most think he never died. Some say he simply became too strong to need a body anymore, that he dissolved into the chain of thought he created, the invisible network humming like buried lightning under the skin of the world. And if you stand in the ruins of Rutland Plantation on a windless night and press your ear to the old oak beam still scarred by his handprints, you'll hear the faintest whisper like the murmur of a coming tide. Awake.